Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to talk about today. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Lauren McKenzie. I'm the Senior Policy Associate for Early Learning at Texans Care for Children. Texans Care is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, multi-issue advocacy organization whose mission is to drive state policy to improve the lives of children and families. Thank you all for joining us today for this really important and timely topic around governance in early childhood education. Like many states, early childhood education and care in Texas includes a number of different programs. This includes our public pre-K program, child care scholarships, Head Start, early childhood special education, and early childhood intervention, just to name a few. And each of these programs has its own agencies, oversight, funding streams, and eligibility rules. And all of these different governance structures and systems can create real challenges for families. For example, when programs operate under different quality standards, that might lead to uneven experiences for families. A lack of coordination between programs can create gaps during really key transitions. You see this in the transition from early childhood intervention to early childhood special education, or from Head Start to kindergarten. And these gaps illustrate how governance is really important and directly impacts the experiences of young children and their families. When we talk about governance, we're talking about more than just which agency administers which program. We're talking about how decisions are made, who has authority, whose responsibilities, and how those responsibilities are shared, how we align efforts across agencies and sectors to create a cohesive system. It's the foundation and the frameworks that are all necessary to turn policy into a real lasting change for children and families. So here in Texas, we have a number of really exciting opportunities on the horizon. Just this past legislative session, the House passed House Bill 117 by Representative Schoolcraft and Senator Campbell to create a governor's task force for the governance of early childhood education. We also have a number of ongoing conversations about the coordination from pre-K, childcare, and Head Start. We also have the sunset review process. This is a regular evaluation of the Texas legislature uses to determine whether state agencies are effectively carrying out their missions and how they can be improved. This year, we have several agencies who oversee key children's programs under review, including the Texas Workforce Commission, Health and Human Services Commission, and the Department of Family and Protective Services. So together, all of these efforts are opening the door to not only uplift the current challenges in our governance structures, but also identify opportunities to better support children and families. So we're thrilled today to be joined by Elliot Regenstein. Elliot has extensive experience in state-level policy and advocacy and has a particular focus in early learning. He's consulted with more than 24 states on a wide range of education policy topics. Much of that work has really focused in on what we're going to be talking about today. It's how decisions are made in state education and early education systems, what information stakeholders need to have to support those decisions, and what incentives are acting on all of our key stakeholders. He is a frequent author, and he actually has an upcoming book about governance that we will mention today. He also speaks a lot about accountability, governance, state data systems, and the connections between early learning and our K-12 public education systems. Today, Elliot's going to share a little bit with us about how we can begin to review early childhood governance in Texas, the questions we should be asking, and what information is really needed to uncover these opportunities to improve the lives of children and families. So we're going to start with Elliot sharing some key insights. We'll have a few questions for him, and then we'll also have some time for all of you to ask questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function below to ask your questions for Elliot. I also just mentioned that we are recording this webinar, and that will be shared out at a later time. With that, let's get started. Elliot, I'll turn it over to you.
Lauren, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and congratulations to everybody for all the good work they've done on building Texas's early childhood system to the point it's already at. And hopefully what I share with you today will be helpful in taking it to another level, right? I mean, there's so many, as in Texas, as in so many states, there are a lot of good people who've done a ton of good work. And being thoughtful about what the best ways forward are is always useful. So hopefully I can contribute to those conversations. And again, grateful for the chance to do that today. So we're going to start by talking about what are some of the right questions you need to be asking about governance of early learning programs. And so what we'll talk about is first, how not to start talking about early childhood governance. Then we'll get into much greater depth about how you actually do want to start talking about early childhood governance. Some of the questions, we'll talk about why early childhood governance change is an important topic, and then we'll go into some of the issues that a task force might address. And again, congratulations on getting the task force passed. So, it's a great thing to have a task force. This can be a very valuable part of the process of discussing governance change and the potential to engage a lot of key stakeholders, many of whom are on this call, many of whom are probably not. Just want to flag at the outset, this is not easy work, right? And that there are a number of tensions that the task force will have to deal with. Again, this is not specific to Texas, this is just built into the system, but that there is an inherent tension between the folks inside government and the folks outside government, right? Each of them have different perspectives and make different contributions, and they may have different visions for how this should work. There are tensions within government, right? Each different agency comes from its own perspective, has its own expertise and niche, and these processes can be somewhat disruptive, right? So folks can be concerned about that, and it's sometimes hard to coordinate internally. Even within agencies, folks may have different perspectives on that, right? A governance change can look very different from the perspective of an agency head or the agency head's top staff or a division manager or frontline staff. It is also the case that folks on the outside of government may have different views. Different providers communities may want different things. Advocates may want something different than the providers, right? So again, there's not necessarily going to be full alignment on that side of the table either. And of course, within all of these groups, there are some folks who are oriented toward change and others who are more comfortable with the status quo. And those tensions will cut across all of these lines. So again, this is not to say that it can't happen, but that it's only to name these tensions at the outset so that when they surface, no one is taken by surprise. One of the things I want to emphasize is do not start your process by talking to other states about their models, right? It will in time be extremely useful to learn about what other states have done, but that before you start having those conversations, it's important to focus on what is Texas looking for out of this, right? I've seen states that have had this conversation started by talking to everybody else, and it often ends up leaving them feeling a little bit lost, right? People from other states will definitely talk about like, hey, we did this and it really worked, and that's great, but their context is different. So the first thing I would recommend doing is figure out your own context and then look at the other models through that lens, and then they'll be much more useful, right? On the next slide, it talks about how you actually get started. So again, work among yourselves, right, among Texans, to figure out what is it you're trying to accomplish. What are the things that the system is doing well that you want to preserve? What are some of the challenges that you want the governance change to address, right? And be pretty specific about that. We'll get into that. You've got to understand what the values are driving the work before you get into the mechanics. And so, again, the first thing a task force can do is get into those values. And there are a number of values that have led states, about half of them now, to change their early childhood governance. So some of these are articulated starting on the next slide. Some of the priorities that states typically focus on in some combination are minimizing the burden on families, right? You heard Lauren talking about how it can be hard for families to navigate the system. Ensuring quality and being consistent about what is quality, right? Having a single entity responsible for that can make it easier for everybody to understand what it is you're trying to achieve. Expanding access, again, in some states that's a priority, others less so. Improving efficiency, right? How is government making the most of the resources it's already spending? And elevating leadership. This is a really key one for a lot of states. The idea that in a fragmented system, the senior-most people focused full-time on early childhood are division managers who are often not fully empowered within their agency, right? one of the questions that I often try to ask is who is the senior most state official whose full-time job is early childhood and is empowered to take action on behalf of the entire system? In many states, that job doesn't exist. And so states have thought that it would be useful to create it. So, but all of these values can fit in some way, right? And I'm sorry, Stephanie, if you could just go back a sec. And so again, it's important to be clear on what are you emphasizing? How are you fitting these things together as you get started? Okay, so on the next slide, Texas has a mixed delivery system, as do basically every state, with the exception of Hawaii. But mixed delivery basically means, and even Hawaii has some aspects of it, but that the idea of a mixed delivery system is that early education is provided through a combination of programs, providers, and settings, right? It's not just schools, it's not just private providers, it's not just childcare, it's not just Head Start, it's not just pre-K, it's all of those things, and it's a lot of different settings. And again, there's both public and private funds, right? Particularly in childcare, as many of you know, private pay is actually the main driver of the market, and the state is providing subsidies to support that. So on the next slide, from the family perspective, again, there are some families who are savvy about the differences among different funding streams and programs, but many of them are not, and they shouldn't have to be, right? That what families are looking for is high quality early education and care services from someone in their community. They don't, they care how much they have to pay for it. They don't care how the state and federal government are paying for it. What they really want is information about the kinds of experiences that are available, right? Which is not always easy to find. Who actually has space right now, right? Many families are just applying to multiple providers trying to get a spot. They don't necessarily understand the process. They don't necessarily have much support in it. And again, they know that like it's on them to find something because the providers are not well organized and coordinated, and there isn't necessarily centralized support from a community organization or the state. Again, that's not to say this is universal, but that is unfortunately a relatively typical process. As far as providers go, again, providers includes both public entities like schools and private businesses and private nonprofits. So it is a complicated market. In many cases, the state is setting parameter, particularly for the private providers, the state is setting parameters for the services and then paying for those services to be delivered through multiple providers, right? And so the focus should be on the service, not the nature of the provider. If providers are delivering subsidized childcare, though, they are trying to remain affordable and competitive in a market with very low margins and where demand is high, but capacity is low, in part because it's hard to maintain staff. Some providers are using public funding, some are not. And the ones who are often using multiple kinds of funding, which can lead to multiple forms of oversight with regulations that may conflict or overlap or leave gaps in ways that are operationally difficult. So for a private provider, you may be dealing with multiple oversight agencies at both the state and the local level. When questions that come up that speak to tensions between those forms of oversight, there may be no one whose job it is to actually resolve that, right? And you may need to get agencies to collaborate on that in ways that neither of them is strictly mandated to do. So the other thing that happens is that when the state performs its core functions relating to this mixed delivery system, it may be doing that multiple times from multiple different vantage points. And we'll get into that in just a couple of slides. So again, when you think about structural issues that a task force should discuss, on the next slide, it starts to lay out some of the functions that state government performs, right? So money management, budgeting, getting funds out the door to providers, right? Helping providers understand their own finances. These are all fiscal related services that are important and that are currently being done in multiple different places. Similarly, setting standards for quality, right? Defining what quality is, and then helping programs improve to reach that definition is something that, again, in Texas, as in many states, is being done in several different places. Supporting professionals. Again, the market for professionals in early childhood is fluid. People can move among provider settings. They can move between early childhood and the schools, right? but there is no single body responsible for thinking about that workforce as a whole and helping to support it as a group. Engaging families and communities. Again, there's a lot of program specific work going on in this area, but there's not necessarily a focused effort by the state to hear from families, communicate to families, thinking holistically across multiple programs. So one thing that states have tried to do is organize by function, right? Like get everything under one roof. And then instead of having your quality support professionals for pre-K and your quality support professionals for childcare, you have quality support professionals and they work with both childcare and pre-K and they become expert in both and they understand how all of it fits into a larger ecosystem. And that efficiency is meant to make government, state government work more effectively and help providers and families to accomplish their goals with greater ease. So on the next slide, this represents a reality that has emerged over the course of the last few decades, right? Every program that Texas has was put where it is for some good reason, right? Childcare is on an agency focused on supporting the workforce. That makes sense, right? Childcare is designed as a workforce support. And if you don't have subsidized childcare, there are many people who won't be able to seek outside employment. Pre-K is an educational function and it's put at the education agency. Early intervention is in an agency with health expertise, and licensing is in an agency with health and safety expertise. All of those things make sense on their own, but all of those decisions were made at a time where we hadn't learned what we now know about the interplay of all of these pieces and how an early childhood system, as it grows, can emerge into something that could be a coherent whole, but by and large is not. So again, not criticizing any of the initial decisions that were made. Every state made the same set of decisions, but the world has changed and there's been a lot of development in the early childhood ecosystem. One of the ways I try to describe it is that, when you think about highways, right, there is one agency that oversees highways. You do not have one agency that oversees how cars go on the highway and another that oversees how trucks and motorcycles go on the highway, right? So people did not used to think of early childhood as its own highway. Now they do. And that's part of why this shift has occurred in so many states. So on the next slide, it is important also to think in a state with a tradition of local control, as Texas is, that this is not about having state government do more necessarily. It can be about state government doing things differently and about supporting community level capacity in a new way, right? So there are a number of functions, particularly with regard to supporting families and providers, that actually you can't do statewide in a state like Texas. And I will say parenthetically, I had this conversation in Rhode Island and people were like, what are you talking about? Texas is a lot bigger, right? So you've got to think about how are you building capacity in communities all around the state and what is the state role in supporting that local capacity, right? So for example, there are some states that have thought, oh, like we want to have our community level leaders be the ones who are on the front lines of helping parents find services. But what we can do is build a single statewide data infrastructure so that they have good information to help families and you don't have to build that data infrastructure in every little town across the state, right? So it is useful to think about governance as both state and local and think about what is the authority you want to vest at the local level and how can the state support those communities that have the most limited financial resources, right? All communities have capital and expertise and a lot to give, but not all of them have enough money to make this work. So on the next slide, the idea of changing governance, is again one that is clearly at least alive in Texas and has gone through a lot of other states as well. Sometimes states create a new early childhood agency. Other states consolidate leadership into an existing agency, usually education or human services. There's a couple of other sort of interesting and odd arrangements out there, and there are different benefits and drawbacks to each of these approaches. As I said at the beginning, it is unlikely to be productive to dive deeply into potential benefits and drawbacks before you even know what you're hoping to accomplish, right? You will get to this issue in time. Don't get to it until you're ready. Talk about what you want first and then get into the mechanics of it. The same goes for a discussion of which services should be included in a governance change, right? Obviously, in many states, pre-K and childcare are at the heart of this conversation because they include so many of the same providers and are seen as similar in many ways. That having been said, there are some states that have done it without putting those things together. And so again, all of that should be a live conversation. It is worth noting again that if you start having the conversation about who's going to be part of a thing before you've really come to agreement about what that thing is supposed to do, that is just going to stress people out. I'd add, by the way, that in some states, they've made the decision to start small and think about building outward and then have, right? So create a good functional early childhood enterprise, even in an agent, whether it be a standalone agency or part of another one, see how it goes. And then a few years later, if it's working, say, okay, now here's this other program. And actually, now that we've seen how this works, maybe it makes sense to move that one in too, right? None of this is set in stone. So again, don't be too worried about how that's going to happen down the road. Focus on what you're trying to accomplish and know that you will get to that in time. Okay. Um, One of the things that's also worth pointing out about state government when it changes is that unifying governance generally doesn't change the head count all that much one way or the other. There are some efficiencies that are gained by getting rid of redundancies, but there's also some amount of new administrative leadership that's required. Usually on balance, that comes out about even. What fundamentally changes is government's role and how state government is interacting with communities, providers, and families. And again, particularly in a state the size of Texas, you are already spending hundreds of millions of dollars on early childhood education. And the focus of this conversation should be about how are those hundreds of millions of dollars going to be spent to maximize their impact on children and families, not like, can we save a few $1,000s by squeezing out an FTE or two, right? Keep your eye on the big picture. Again, always want to try to be efficient in the small picture too, but that is the main thing that you should focus on trying to accomplish. And that if you're doing it right, you'll create a new and more accountable approach to decision making and constituent engagement. Okay, next slide. Yeah, as I said, think about the system you want to have and come up with an approach that supports that system that is implementable, right? There are some things that are just for whatever reason not going to wash in the Texas political context. That's okay. Like there's no single, this is not something where there is a single magical right answer and either you get it or you don't. It is a super contextual inquiry. So Texas specific factors matter, right? Don't ignore them. Don't write them off. Don't say, oh, I wish we were different. You're not different. You are who you are. And while change is possible over time, those things that can't be changed, just take account for them, right? Like it's absolutely doable. That having been said, it is going to be really important for people to get on the same page about this because it is really hard to do governance change. And if there are multiple conflicting visions for it, it will probably not happen, right? If you are a legislator for whom this is not your number one issue, and you're considering a bill to make some sort of governance change, and you've got 5 different people telling you, wait, this is good or bad about it, this is bad, you tune that out and you just say, we're not ready yet. So one of the functions a task force can perform is help get everybody on the same page about that and set the frame for what's possible, right? The task force is not going to solve all the problems. It's not going to identify every single policy that can be changed and how that will happen, but that it can help to define a world in which Texas is running its early childhood system more efficiently and some key elements that are needed to make that happen. So again, it's important to define some key outcomes you want, and then just make sure that you've got the staffing and support to make that come to life. And that is it. I've said a lot and I've said it pretty quickly, but the goal was to leave plenty of time for Q&A. And so, Lauren, I will be excited to answer any questions that you have or that others in the group want to jump in with as well.
Yes, thank you for that. I think you really helped us set the stage on the conversation we're about to have. And so, for everyone listening in, we have some questions for Elliot that we're going to get started with to really kind of narrow in on some of this broad wisdom that he shared with us today. But please feel free to use the Q&A function below to drop your specific questions in, and we'll help you get some answers to those. But I want to start off. I think one thing, Elliot, that you really emphasized is this idea that in beginning this work around governance in Texas, we need to spend ample time really thinking about what we're trying to accomplish. And so I'm wondering if you could offer everyone on this call who represents every stakeholder group that we have, what are some practical advice for really getting clarity on what the task force should be aiming to accomplish, even though we have a lot of different stakeholders with different priorities?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that task forces hopefully can surface is that bumbling underneath the differences, there's a lot of similarity, right? And one of the things I've often found helpful is to have some number of individual conversations with folks who are on a task force or adjacent to a task force like this, and just ask them, hey, like, what are you looking for out of this? And themes will emerge, right? Again, and if it makes more sense to do some of that in group conversation, that can also work. But like, the universe of things you're trying to accomplish is not limitless, right? I identified some of them. There may be others. You could organize it somewhat differently, but that fundamentally, you know, making it easier for families to access service and making it easier for providers to deliver those services, those are the core things that state government is trying to support. And people will have different takes on how that should happen, but that mostly they'll probably coalesce around those being key priorities. And then again, you can start to surface some of the nuances of things that people want to dive into. But it is really important, I think, to assume that people have similar goals for this work. Test that, but that, people are generally on the same side about wanting things to be good for children and families. They may differ a little bit on how, but that if you can get high level agreement on what kind of outcomes you're looking for, then you can structure a process that resolves whatever differences are outstanding and gets you to a place of clarity.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in your bio, we mentioned that you've worked with a number of different states. And I think, what I'm taking away from our conversation right now is this idea of really kind of focusing in on those areas of agreement. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how, in those initial conversations, how you might identify what agreements you can move forward in, and some areas that might uh, need some more teasing out, more discussion, and may not need to be a big change right now.
I think that one of the ways you can accomplish that is by focusing the initial conversation less on the mechanics of governance, as I suggested, and more on like, what do you want to be true for children and families in their communities, right? And how do you want providers to be able to serve them? How do you want providers to be supported? And that because what you are ultimately trying to do is create a governance process that delivers those things, right? Governance is not an end so much as a means. It is a process improvement, and it is a process designed, a it is a process meant to produce certain outcomes, and at least getting some high level clarity about those outcomes. Again, much of which you've probably talked about before, but just making sure that everybody's really like, yes, like here's what we want to be true for children and families, and here's again at a high level how we want programs to be interacting and how we want them to harmonize with each other. Again, building that grounding first then sets the stage for, okay, given that, how do we want to operationalize that at the state government level? And what it does to some degree also is set parameters for that next conversation, because if someone is going, if you say, okay, we've agreed, here's what we're trying to accomplish, any comment someone makes, like, oh, I don't want to participate in this, or I don't think my agency should be a part of it, you can ask, okay, why do you think that helps us accomplish our goal? And if they've got a good answer, great. But if they don't, then you can proceed, then maybe you cause them to reflect and say, okay, actually, maybe what's best for the system as a whole is actually something that I didn't personally think would be best for me or my agency, right? And again, that's not any criticism of the folks who are going to raise valid concerns throughout this process, but only to say that the more agreement you have about what you're trying to accomplish at the beginning, the harder it is, or the easier it is to avoid going down rabbit holes of people bringing up idiosyncratic problems that they want to see solved.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in that, you've emphasized the importance of leadership. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what leadership is really needed to kind of develop a more coherent early learning system.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of different parts of that. I mean, one is that if you look at the history of how governance change occurs, there's really only one governance change that occurred despite a governor not wanting it to happen, right? Now, different governors have played different roles and shown different levels of involvement, but that in general, if the governor's office doesn't want this to happen and isn't willing to commit to making some aspects of it happen, then it's unlikely to be all that successful. So that's kind of the first level. And again, that gubernatorial leadership is necessary but not sufficient. There's a lot of other things that need to be true for this work to go well. But that if the governor's like, I don't care, then it's unlikely to be successful. And again, like you've gotten this far, so that's a good sign. But it's going to be important to remain engaged with the executive branch throughout to make sure that that leadership potential remains in place. Um, Once you get deeper into it, though, you'll start facing one of the challenges that leads people to have this conversation in the first place, which is that early childhood doesn't have its own agency heads, right? And I will say one of my formative conversations, one of my formative experiences on this was 15 years ago now in Georgia, which was one of the first states to create its own early childhood agency. And I was used to going to states and having conversations with early childhood division managers who would come to some sort of tentative agreement and then all say, I've got to go back to my agency and get clearance for this. And that maybe a few weeks later, you'd actually have something resembling an agreement. More likely, someone would have had to go a different direction, and then you got to start over again, right? But in Georgia, there was an agency head and there was an initiative they were working on, and she called a meeting with three other agency heads, and they sat around the table and they hashed it all out, right? So ultimately, the kind of leadership that you're looking for in early childhood is that. And again, that is not meant to be any knock on the people currently occupying what are the senior-most early childhood positions in the state. It is only that those positions probably have not been designed to empower those people to think systemically and to engage in problem solving at that level. So one of the major ideas behind governance change is that it should be someone's job to have that kind of authority and be able to solve problems at that level, which again doesn't require your own agency necessarily if you have a strong deputy in a larger agency. Again, there's no magical right answer to that, but it's got to be someone who's at a senior enough level that when they call other agencies and are like, we need to solve this problem together, that call gets returned.
Yeah. And I appreciate you really thinking about that this could look very different. It doesn't have to be a state office. It can look like interagency work, but the importance is really that authority and that empowerment for that individual to think systemically across programs. So thank you for that. There is no doubt that funding plays a really critical role in supporting early childhood systems. But something that I think that you really talked about in your presentation that's really interesting is how we can change our mindset to thinking instead of just funding and funding streams, which is typically a lot of times how we think about programs and organizing, braiding and blending, right? How do we shift our mindset from thinking about these funding streams and instead thinking about functions? And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. How do we shift our mindset into thinking more about the functions of these different programs instead of just the funding streams?
So that's a good question. And it's something, this is something where, again, this is not necessarily something that the task force would necessarily want to dwell on because a lot of this gets into the mechanics of how you bring multiple units together if you decide to bring multiple units together. So, and again, there's now a fairly substantial body of state experience where, they have not just sort of, I did a governance paper a few years ago where one state talked about how in the end, all they had done is bring the silos closer together, and that actually doesn't solve the problems you change governance to solve. So what states are really doing is when they are making changes, they think, okay, what's actually the organizational structure that is going to make this more effective? And that work should be in consultation with outside stakeholders, but that work really ends up getting driven by state agency leaders once a decision has been made to go forward. And again, different agencies will have different perspectives on this, right? In some, and again, I've seen this in states where like some agencies are like, oh, like we really want this new unit to be successful. And like, what can we do to like put in resources or make that happen? And other agencies are like, yeah, like you're taking those people, like good luck, So again, obviously gubernatorial leadership can be helpful in sort of keeping everybody at the table, but that those conversations about function, I highlight them here because they're really important to the ultimate success of any new enterprise, but that's not where you start, right? Like you start with the vision of what you're trying to accomplish. And while it's helpful to have some sense of how those functional conversations will play out, you don't even necessarily need to have all of that nailed down before making a decision to say, okay, we're going to create an office or an agency or a unit within a larger agency. You want to have that be part of the charge to figure that out, but you don't need to figure all of that out in advance.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Um, One other thing that I think is really interesting is thinking about uh, the history and emphasis in Texas on local control. And we have a lot of different local governance bodies that oversee various programs. This can be education service centers, local workforce development boards. This past session in HB2, we saw intermediary organizations codified to support our pre-K partnerships. And so we have a lot of different local bodies kind of charged with supporting these programs in different ways. And so I'm wondering what key questions we should be asking and thinking about how do we support this local capacity and allow them to be responsive to their community needs while also trying to streamline some of our state governments throughout the state. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as with the larger state conversation, a lot of it starts with like, what do you want them doing, right? And again, it's not, I will say, if you have all that figured out at the same time as you figured out what you want to do at the state level, great. But if not, it's okay to say, you know what, like we're going to empower a new unit at the state government agency, whatever you want to call it, to take a little time to get to know what's going on out there and figure out how best to navigate and harmonize this. But that having been said, again, like clarity of purpose is really key. So for example, if there are certain functions relating to, family engagement or, supporting families to find services or professional development for providers that you think we really want that to be a local function, it's good to know that going in, and you don't necessarily have to have complete answers to how that's going to work locally, but only when you're starting to design your state agency, you're thinking, okay, here are the functions that the state agency is going to perform itself, and here are the functions where the state agency is going to support this function happening locally, and you design the agency accordingly. So again, like it's worth having a conversation about what are the things you think a community level infrastructure can do so that you're designing around that, but you don't have to have all of that answered before making essentially sort of a go or no go decision.
Yeah, and I think you gave a great example with the data, right? If we're trying to empower local communities to think about making decisions that best meet their community's needs, how can we, at a statewide level, make sure that those local communities have the information and capacity they need to actually make those good choices?
Right. And again, that's something where having a single infrastructure really makes sense, but building capacity to use that infrastructure at the local level also makes sense. Again, like data should be for everybody's use, not just state governments. Um, and I've done a lot of work on data, so I'm pretty, attuned to that particular issue, but that within any other issue, right, professional development or financing or whatever, right, there is some balance, and how that sits between state and local, again, is very contextual and is a conversation worth having at some point. But I would emphasize that those are not things that you need to have figured out in total to know whether or not some sort of governance change is worth it or not.
Yeah, and I will just mention that we did pass a bill this session. The state legislature did around an early childhood integrated data system. So that is something that's also another opportunity that's really a topic of conversation right now to think about how all these pieces play together and really thinking more cohesively about our early childhood system. I do want to ask, thinking specifically about our upcoming governor's task force for the governance of early childhood, the legislation tasks this task force with delivering recommendations by December of 2026. So about a year, roughly, as things get started. And we know that governance changes can take longer than that to really think through and then enact. And so I'm wondering what advice you have for task force members potentially to think about what are those short-term action items that they can do while also keeping long-term planning in mind.
Sure. Well, I mean, again, that's plenty of time for a good task force report. And different states have had different timelines for the actual transition once they adopt it legislatively. Um, so I'm working now with my home state of Illinois, which had basically like a 2-year ramp. Um, I remember talking to a governor's office staffer in a different state with a 2-year run up who said basically like, I wish it had been a year because now like stuff is just rising to fill the available time. On the other hand, I've definitely talked to people in Illinois who are like, I wish we had longer, but like we're gonna do what we're gonna do. Um, so with regard to the task force, again, it's important to just think about like where can a task force really add value and where can it not, right? A task force can probably add a lot of value in defining sort of what it is you're hoping a governance system will accomplish, providing a sense of like, here are things that are probably good as state functions, things that are probably good as local functions, and here are some of the services that we would like to see included in any sort of, holistic governance change. And also, here's what relationships we would like to see between whatever is created and everybody else who isn't part of the direct, unification. So, I mean, again, those are all things where a task force can do a really nice job of sort of saying, like, here's what the consensus of the community is and provide direction. And that's probably enough to go to a legislature with, because a lot of the conversations you need to have about like exactly how are you going to structure these functions, exactly how are you going to weave these things together, exactly what gets done at the state level and what gets done locally, are things that actually you might want to have the unified agency be in process to discuss. And so again, like the sequencing, again, there's no magical right sequencing either, but that in general, you're better off figuring out like, what are we trying to accomplish? Directionally, how do we want to go about it? And then if you can get if the legislature wants to weigh in and say, yes, like we are going in this direction, you then have a process of a year or two after that where you give yourself a chance to get it set up before it goes fully operational.
And something that I think you really emphasized earlier was thinking about the task force is really helping serving as a unifying function, right? Thinking about how do we engage stakeholders, really think about what challenges we're trying to solve, and really paint that vision for how to move forward.
Yeah, and it's also worth thinking about with the task force, like what are the things that we have to agree on in order for this to be worth it? And what are the things that if we don't agree on them, that's okay, we can figure it out later, right? So, again, like this is a bit of an uphill battle, right? Like you are asking for change and it's hopefully relatively easy to articulate the potential benefits of the change, but not everyone's going to buy into those. And it may feel to some people like a lot of work. So the more the task force can demystify that to some degree, the better off you're going to be. And again, to the extent that there feels like there's sort of ambient disagreement, work that through, right? Because being, if you're not unified at the beginning, it's unlikely you're going to get more unified as the process goes along, right? You need to be relatively on the same page to get started, knowing that there are challenges at every step of the implementation process, but that if there are sort of fundamental divides that seem unbridgeable at the outset, then legislation to create some new unit is probably not in the cards.
Yeah. And one thing that I think is helpful for this conversation too is your emphasis on how it's very complex, it's very context dependent. You have seen states with very large scale changes and states with smaller changes, um, both who have been successful and unsuccessful in those changes. And so I'm curious, for those states that are having relative success of moving, making positive change, what do you think those key factors are in that success?
Yeah, and it's so and there's a question in the Q&A, can you give an example of a state that you think is doing governance well and share what you think they're doing right? So eh, let me preface my answer by saying that I have not worked deeply with every state that has made a governance change, but will base my answer on the ones that I have worked with or, talked to extensively. And again, so the fact that I omitted somebody does not mean that I don't think they're doing a good job. Just want to clarify. But a couple of the states that have historically and currently done good work. So one that I'm pretty familiar with is Virginia, right? So Virginia created a structure where they have a deputy superintendent in their education department. Um, and that agency has oversight of both childcare and pre-K, among other things. And part of what's made that successful is some of the things, we highlighted as reasons to make a change. They have very strong leadership with a very clear vision of what they're trying to accomplish. They're empowered, right? Like the governor supports it. And, the person is senior, the person in charge is senior enough to make a difference. They're building the data infrastructure needed to actually answer questions as opposed to just speculate about them. They work effectively with other partners. They've got a strong community level infrastructure that they're leveraging. So, again, Virginia has a state restriction on governors cannot run for reelection. So they have built certain structures at the local level to provide continuity, having to account for that. Again, that's a contextual factor that's not present elsewhere. Another one of the OGs that has done a really good job is Georgia, which was one of the first states to create a standalone early childhood agency. And it was really originally about pre-K, but over time took on childcare as well. And again, they've been very thoughtful about appointing strong leaders who fit the governor's cabinet and are able to operate effectively, but also, again, being thoughtful about research and data infrastructure and, using again, not just sort of flying blind, but really saying, okay, what do we know about the system we're responsible for and how are we managing it? And I think those are some really well-respected ones. There have been some other changes. Again, there's been a wave of change in the last 5 years, and with many of those, it's probably a little too early to say. A couple of others that I'd point out were Louisiana. Changed their governance back when John White was superintendent, and that's pre-pandemic. But again, they did it in part because they had a really clear vision of quality across both childcare and pre-K, and wanted to have the authority necessary to make that work. Another state that's more recent but has had a lot of success is New Mexico, right? Your neighbor on the other side, who created an agency when Governor Lujan Grisham came in, and again has really invested a lot of political capital in strengthening their system in a way that having a standalone agency has been really meaningful. So those are not the only examples of good things happening through, unified leadership, but those are some examples of places that have built a strong infrastructure and then been able to use it relatively effectively. And
Yeah.
it's certainly not to say, by the way, that in all of those states, everything is peachy keen and hunky dory and nothing ever goes wrong. But it's only to say that in those states, when you talk, most of the people I've talked to who lived through the transitions have said it is better now, and that having that unified, organized leadership when stuff comes up makes a difference. That was one of the reasons I think the pandemic sparked a lot of states to try to change their governance, because as they were dealing with the mechanics of childcare emergencies and pre-K, realizing how the fragmented system had sort of reached an equilibrium where it could putter along fine enough on a regular day, but then when there was a crisis and you didn't have anyone who was really empowered to deal with the crisis across systems, and that just made it worse, that made people think, okay, actually, like this isn't okay, and we need to do something better.
Yeah. And I'm curious because I think you and a lot of your writing have really emphasized that governance changes can produce some systemic outputs. So, thinking about sustainability and efficiency, but that governance alone won't necessarily produce improved child outcomes. So, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why governance is still really important and what other strategies, policies, investments should we be looking to in the future to really think about how this governance work sets the foundation for real benefits to children and families down the line.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And a lot of it's about helping the helpers, right? Like it is indirect, but it is important. And I've talked about the complexity. It is worth saying some amount of complexity is you can't get rid of, right? Like it is a diverse provider system. It's going to have schools, it's going to have private providers, some of whom are center-based, some of whom are home-based. That's a strength, not a weakness, but it is complicated, right? The And there are multiple funding streams. There's Head Start, there's childcare, there's state pre-K, and then at least in the short term, those are all going to continue to exist. There's home visiting, there's special education. Again, those are all different. And that while states are having some interesting conversations about funding, some amount of complexity is just part of the system. So the question then is, how are you dealing with that complexity? And who is bearing the burden? How are you minimizing its existence? And to the extent that it still exists, where does it sit? Right. And so part of what states have decided is, first of all, we want to undertake a focused effort to make it less complicated. And second of all, to the extent that it's going to be complicated, it's actually state government's job to solve that problem and insulate communities, providers, and families from that complexity. Because the more you simplify it at the state level, and the more you put the burden on state government, the less work there actually is for communities and families and providers. And that actually those folks are not in the best position to absorb some of that complexity. The state is, right? And again, that's not to say that the state should be empire building or taking on more responsibilities than it can handle, but even just for the responsibilities that it already has, if the state starts thinking about them in the frame of how are we doing this as a collective to make things easier for families, as opposed to just, I have this funding stream and it has statutory requirements, and I'm going to make sure those statutory requirements are complied with. Right. Again, that's a pretty fundamentally different role that is much more customer service oriented. You could almost think of it like a business, like a small business agency that supports the many providers, again, not all of whom are businesses, but all of whom are at the community level. How are you supporting those folks to do their job effectively and taking things off their plate so that they only can, they can focus as much as possible on their direct interactions with children and families and improving their outcomes. And similarly for families, right? South Carolina has been a leader in creating systems and their state and local components of it that make it easier for families to find and register for services, right? And the state plays a role in that, communities play a role in that, but the thrust is, how do we make it so that when families are looking for services, they can have the maximum reach with minimum effort, and that it takes some amount of work by the state to do that. But once you've done that work at the state level, you're potentially making it easier for millions of families on an ongoing basis, and that's the payoff.
Yeah. And with that, I think, my last question, and please, if you have questions, please continue to drop them in the Q&A. We have a few more minutes left. I know there's a couple that I want to try and get to after this question. Um, but I want to end my questions with really thinking about governance and systems can really start to sound pretty abstract sometimes. And really trying to think through how can we as stakeholders keep our focus on children and families throughout all of these conversations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in that sense, it goes back to the question I asked earlier. In state government is the senior most official whose job it is to make sure that children and families are having a good experience and that is empowered to actually make that happen, right? And there are a lot of people in state government whose job it is to try to help improve the experience of children and families. But there's probably, as I understand the Texas landscape, there's actually nobody who's empowered to act on that across multiple systems. And that's part of why those children and families aren't having the best possible experience. So, keeping the experience of children and families at the forefront of every conversation is critical, but understanding that bureaucratic overlap and bad design at the state level has a negative impact on children and families, and that you can get rid of that impact or at least reduce it should be what animates the work.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do want to, there was a couple of questions for a little bit more detail about the task force. And so I do want to just share that that language is pretty explicit on who is going to be on the task force. The steering committee consists of agency leads from the Texas Education Agency, Texas Workforce Commission, and Health and Human Services Commission, as well as some senior level program officers and the deputy director for interagency activities, which is housed at the TEA. The task force members are all going to be appointed by the governor, but many of those are still very specific. They include a certified public pre-K teacher, a certified pre-K teacher that teaches in a private childcare setting or a private school, someone who represents the Head Start Collaboration Office, representatives from the Texas Early Learning Council, and then a few other appointed stakeholders who might represent nonprofits or other experts in early childhood. Much of that process will go through the governor's appointment office, and you can find more information there. But also, please feel free to email me, and I'm always happy to connect with you and continue to try to facilitate different voices from all over the state and different constituencies being represented in these types of task force. So thank you for that question. I do also want to, in our last couple of minutes here, hopefully we can get to one more question. But Steph, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and sharing one, we are going to share a link to a article that Elliot wrote a couple of years ago now called Getting from Here to There. There we go. And it has a bunch of these concepts outlined. It also walks through a number of questions that you can be asking as you walk through the process of governance change. So we're going to share that link. We're also going to share a QR code for a discount on Elliot's new book coming up on our screen so that you can go ahead and get that. And Elliot, I'll let you, if you have anything you want to add about the upcoming book.
Yeah, so the book is really about broader systems, and it talks a lot about how state government works, how local governance can work, data infrastructure, and then the role of advocacy and philanthropy. So really a lot of things that sit at the intersection of this conversation. And I would add that if folks have questions, they should feel free to reach out to me. I see that there was a question from someone about how support and training should be governed to meet the 21st century's child's needs. And again, that's exactly the kind of question that it should be someone's job. There should be clarity about how that works, right? Like, I don't have the actual answer to what exactly is the support and training necessary, but there should be someone at the state whose job it is to be thinking about that on an ongoing basis and working with communities to make sure that that happens, and any number of other things that folks on this call are really deeply concerned about. So again, a lot of this is about how those questions get answered. And that's not entirely satisfying, I know, at the outset, because it would be nice if those questions were just answered, but that it is really thinking about the process by which this work gets done on an ongoing basis.
Yes, thank you for that. And I'll add that one of the charges of the task force is to think about quality. And I definitely think educator support and training is a piece of that. And so there is a little bit of that thinking going on already with the task force, but is definitely something that will continue to be discussed and evolve. So thank you so much, Elliot, for that. Please feel free to scan this QR code to get more information and go ahead and pre-order Elliot's new book. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing to connect with you about all the things happening with the task force, as well as other opportunities like the preschooler strategic plan for children with disabilities, the quad agency childcare regulatory review. Lots of opportunities for these conversations coming up in Texas, and we look forward to working with everyone on this call about those opportunities. Thank you so much, Elliot, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.